Well, I'd like to thank the organisers of this meeting, first of all, for the invitation to give this keynote speech. It comes from a larger piece of work that I'm trying to do, which is to write about the history of how climate has been seen to be the explanation for, well, frankly, most everything. And I'm a little bit skeptical about its omnipotent powers, which is not, of course, for a minute to deny the huge significance that climate change is having in our own world right now. So when I was talking with Simon about this, what I thought I would do is do something that is both contemporary but also historical, that we can understand something of the role that climate has been thought to play in human history, and also the role that people think climate will play in our future history, if I can put it that way. So our past and our future is the weather to blame. In a recent piece for the New York-based organisation Global Citizen, the columnist Joe McCarthy posed the question, is climate change really a national security threat? Framed this way, he began, the question contains a sense of Hollywood inevitability. Climate change brings drought to a region. Different factions struggle for precious water resources and end up clashing. These plots, McCarthy says, might be suitable for a big budget script, but do they bear any resemblance to reality? And he concluded, military experts seem to think so. I think he might well have added, so would Thomas Malthus. So here's my first theme, apocalypse now, or at least pretty soon. The sense of eschatological inevitability in some climate scenarios seems to me to be palpable, and it's commonly heard. Some of you in the room may remember Chris Huhne, then Britain's Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, as he put it in 2011 to the Future Maritime Operations Conference in a speech entitled The Geopolitics of Climate Change. He said this, climate change will lead to an increased threat of war, violence, and military action against the UK, and risks reversing the progress of civilization. Now, it's this impulse towards militarizing climate that is of interest to me today. Even in the current White House, as part of an administration widely known to be skeptical of the claims of climate change scientists, Defense Secretary General James Mad Dog Mattis observed during his confirmation hearings, the effects of a changing climate impact our security situation. I will ensure that the department continues to be prepared to conduct operations today and in the future, and that we are prepared to address the effects of a changing climate on our threat assessments, resources, and readiness. Interesting to think that the only place that climate change thinking might occupy in the White House is in connection with the military. It may tell us something. By now, this is a well-known refrain. A decade ago, in 2007, the Center for Strategic and International Studies produced a Pentagon-orientated report entitled The Age of Consequences. Here, laying out the security implications of climate change scenarios for American foreign policy, the document announced a range of consequences in robustly apocalyptic language. A sampling will suffice. Among the severe outcomes of a 2.6 degrees Celsius rise in temperature will be what they describe as moral revolution. Massive social upheaval will be accompanied by intense religious and ideological turmoil, the report declared. Among traditional religious beliefs, the losers are likely to be those faiths that have formed the closest association with the secular world and with scientific rationalism. This intensified search for spiritual meaning will be all the more poignant under conditions of severe climate change. At 5.6 degrees increase, a range of ills are covered, and they will converge in one conflagration. Rage at government's inability to deal with the abrupt and unpredictable crises, religious fervour, perhaps even a dramatic rise in millennial end-of-day cults, hostility and violence towards migrants and minority groups, and intra- and interstate conflict over resources. So the resurgence of apocalyptic thought is itself conditioned by what is believed to be climate change. Now, in the light of these apocalyptic divinations, the overall conclusion insisted that it was the security repercussions of climate change that were most important. They were, quotes, a greater foreign policy and national security challenge than reversing the decline in America's global standing or rebuilding the nation's armed forces. Now, I think what's added further urgency to this sense of climatic catalysm are reports from medical organizations stressing the dire health effects of climate change. Curb global warming or face a health catastrophe, the Times newspaper told its readers in June 2015. Climate change, the article began, is creating a medical emergency. Severe drought, it predicted, could well result in 1.5 billion more medical incidents every year. With extreme heat and excessive rainfall, the number could soar to 2 to 3 million, I'm still quoting. Detailing the results of research carried out by an interdisciplinary team of European and Chinese collaborators for the 2015 Lancet magazine, entitled Commission on Health and Climate Change, the newspaper quoted its author's conclusion. Climate change could have potentially catastrophic effects for human health. In comparable vein, the US Natural Resources Defense Council expects the health-related costs of extreme weather incidents to increase, and I quote, by billions more dollars. Small wonder, the report notes, that some people have likened the effects of climate change to weather on steroids. Now, the militarizing and medicalizing of weather are all of a piece with a surge in popular books depicting how climate will indeed write our future. Take, for example, this work, just one of many, Climate Wars, by Gwynne Dyer, published in 2008. To give a sense of urgency to this prophetic Jeremiah, Dyer settled on a number of future scenarios, telling us what it would be like in Russia 2019, North India 2036, China in 2042, and the like. He did this to depict, and this is his word, the apocalyptic impact climate change will have on human civilization. The message is pretty grim. For every degree that the average global temperature rises, so do the number of failed and failing states, and very probably the incidence of internal and international war. Along the way to a projected increase of 2.8 degrees Celsius by 2042, Dyer painted a picture of a collapsed European Union, its northern members struggling to close borders to refugees from the famine-stricken Mediterranean countries. A dominant Russia, he says, will now be the undisputed great power of Asia. And of course, an ever more fragile frontier between the United States and Mexico will be put under intolerable strain. No surprise that the United States military, Dyer concludes, already sees its next major mission as the long struggle to maintain stability as climate change continually undermines it. Now, this inclination to what I'm going to call thermal eschatology is now widespread. Take the National Geographic Channel's 2008 television show, 6 Degrees Could Change the World. Under the strapline, 6 Degrees charts climatic apocalypse in HD television, a columnist with the Denver Post had this to say, likening the program to, wait for it, she likened it to a cool disaster movie, complete with fantastic animation and scary predictions. A meteorological apocalypse, as she put it, was underway. Let's hear what she has to say. At 2 degrees warmer, Category 6 hurricanes become regular occurrences. At 4 degrees, hordes of climate refugees flee famine, with the number increasing into the tens of millions when it gets to 5. Now, accompanying this broadcast was an interactive website inviting visitors to explore the world's future at different degrees of global warming. Thermal eschatology. Enter the site, and a map of the world appears with what I call a disaster dial along the margin. That appears on the screen. In line with the program, viewers are confronted with exactly these dire warnings. You turn the dial to 2 degrees warmer, and what do you find on the map? Urban Bolivians moving into rural areas in search of water. Click on 2 more degrees, and deserts arrive in southern Europe. Click another one at 5, that brings worldwide political upheaval, economic disaster, and armed conflict as heat-weary migrants seek climate refuge in places like Northern Europe and New Zealand. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are arriving. Now, in all these scenarios, the tragic history of your future and mine reduces to the vicissitudes of climate's reign. Here, climate is writing a script that stars Malthus and Hobbes as the leading dramatis personae. Exceed the world's climatically determined carrying capacity, and countless millions will live a life that's nasty, brutish, and very short. The general direction of the tracks along which climate is propelling Homo sapiens is very clear. Apocalypse now, or if not, at least pretty soon. Now, of course, it's not just historians of the future who practice history by degree. The archaeologist Brian Fagan tells his readers an average rise of even a degree or 2 can dash a civilization. The subtitles of a sequence of his popular archaeological works advertise the priority he accords to climate in shaping the human past, of course, as well as the human future. Some of the titles: El Niño and the Fate of Civilizations. How climate made history. How climate changed civilization. Now, while Fagan claims to disavow crude determinism, he is nonetheless sure that climate changes have channeled the entire direction in which human history has flowed. So we're told things like this, that the Norse conquests, cathedrals, these are a consequence of a global climatic phenomenon, an enduring legacy of the medieval warm period. And we're told that the Great Warming propelled humanity across the Bering Strait. At the same time, drawing on the work of Wolfgang Behringer, he attributes the dramatic rise in, wait for it, accusations of witchcraft during the 1560s to changing weather patterns during Europe's Little Ice Age. Now, Fagan is not a lone voice. Numerous authors find and have found in climate and climate change history's first cause, history's primum mobile. Take Jared Diamond, for example. In his prize-winning panorama of global history, Guns, Germs and Steel, he set out to demonstrate how geography had shaped the destiny of Europeans, Asians, Africans, Native Americans and Aboriginal Australians. Now, to be frank, the book is a virtuoso performance. Yet the architecture of the argument is fairly straightforward. Lurking behind the guns, germs and steel that have steered global history, rendering some societies disproportionately powerful and innovative, lies a far more fundamental cause. That cause is food production. In Diamond's vision, everything from the evolution of germs and technological innovation to the development of writing and complex political organization is connected by chains of causation to food provision. It runs something like this. Food production required sedentary living, and hence the accumulation of possessions. In turn, this facilitated more specialized forms of social organization and the emergence of groups not directly engaged in the food-generating process, who could devote themselves to economic management, craft work, political organization, and the like. Global history, to him, it seems, is the story of two things: food and fate. Across the face of the earth, Diamond argues, it was the means of food production, and I quote him, that determined which peoples become history's have-nots and which became history's haves. Where advanced civilizations would develop, It determined which languages would triumph in the worldwide clash of cultures. Behind all this, of course, lie elemental environmental realities. Again and again, behind Diamond's comparative geography of domestic plant and animal cultivation lies one thing: the iron will of climate. As he puts it in a generalizing principle couched in the language of Darwinian adaptationism, which I'm sure you like, Michael, the germination, growth, and disease resistance of plants are adapted to climate. Fine. Each plant population becomes genetically programmed through natural selection to respond appropriately to signals of the seasonal regime under which it has evolved. But in the polity of plants, climate reigns supreme. Consequently, it rules no less imperiously in the story of human affairs. Now, something similar comes through in David Landis's monumental work, The Wealth and Poverty of Nations. Now, in this work, he rails against the champions of multiculturalism, against those interested in egalitarian history. He says these are people who just ignore the real predominance of the West and write as though history had never happened. To Landis, the fact of the matter is simple. I quote him: Western technological precedence just is there. A brute fact. And tellingly, he resorts to the early 20th century writings of Ellsworth Huntington, to whom we'll presently return, to account for why the rich nations and rich countries lie in the temperate zones, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere. The poor countries lie in the tropics and semi-tropics. And so, to explain this geography of economic failure, his first port of call is, of course, climate. To elucidate what he calls, and let me use his words, the simple, direct effects of the environment. Those effects are both physiological and cultural. Everything from the production of perspiration in what he calls the sweaty climates to the siesta, a cultural adaptation designed to keep people inactive in the heat of the day. Better keep the temperature down here today, Simon, or we'll be out for the count. Historically, such tropical and semi-tropical zones just inevitably induced slavery. But more, hot climates also encourage the proliferation of life forms hostile to man, his words, which breed rapidly and encourage the dissemination of disease. Cold weather's better. Winter, he insists, and I quote, is the great friend of humanity. It wipes out insects and parasites. This is what I would call a kind of snow morality that prevails for him. And so the globe is divided, if not exactly into the pestilential and the paradisial, certainly into something pretty close. The consequences are far-reaching in Land's opinion. As he sums it up in Hobbesian tomes, life in poor climates is precarious, depressed, and brutish. Not surprisingly, the adjectives that he appends to European climates stand in marked contrast. They're not precarious, depressed, or brutish. These climates are different. The temperatures are, quotes, kind. The climate is, quotes, privileged. The rain is, quotes, gentle. Now, among those resorting to climate as the primary agent of historical change, what I find in these analyses, to get to my own viewpoint here, is the popularity of what I'm going to call inferential storylines. This is what I call the might-have, must-have school of historical explanation. This device serves to build plausible scenarios, gripping narratives, and compelling plot lines. Let's go back to Brian Fagan, with whom I began. He writes that early Europeans experiencing the Great Warming during 15,000 to 11,000 BC may have, if it's going to come up, please do. Why is that not coming up? May have cut back on hunting. That one solution, this is taking a while. Can I just hit this instead? Yeah, I've got them all now. Might have been to pulverize nuts to overcome the harmful effects of high protein on pregnant women. Similarly, we learn that the harsh drought and cold of the Younger Dryas may have triggered a shift to farming. That when El Nino descended with primordial fury on the Moche civilization, the ideological effect would have been to reinforce the ruler's authority. And then we get to the telling one that the new climatic conditions must have undermined the confidence of generations. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with using speculative suggestions in historical writing, but conjecture can rapidly surrender to certitude, and thus to an easy confidence in the supremely important causal powers of climate. Listen to what he says. After AD 500, prolonged droughts in the southern highlands, far from the Moche homeland, coincided with strong El Nino episodes in the north, causing widespread political adjustments. Here we move from speculation to declaration, from insinuation to affirmation. At the same time, I think what's often missing from such accounts is any sustained engagement with a fundamental distinction between the necessary and sufficient conditions for explaining a historical event. When we're told that Gothic cathedrals, illuminated manuscripts, ethereal woodwork, the material achievements of the High Middle Ages, when we're told that they all depended on abundant food surpluses, we certainly do find ourselves confronted with a necessary condition for those to develop. I mean, no food, no fine art. I mean, frankly, no food, no anything. Right? It's the same with the expansion of Norse fishing grounds, when ice-free conditions prevailed for a longer period after 1000 AD. Sure, no thawing, no trawling. Meat and melting may be necessary conditions for the activities they purport to explain, but are they sufficient to account for what he describes as a veritable orgy of cathedral building, whale fishing, the production of gold-decorated texts, and the like? I don't think so. Without fully exploring other explanatory factors, and by resting content with mere correlations between historical episodes and changed climate conditions, such narratives tend to foreshorten explanation and misconstrue preconditions as causal agents. Well, since climate and conflict seems to be the order of the day, I thought it'd be worthwhile now reflecting just a little bit on climate, conflict, and culpability. I'm going to use one particular example. Attributing success and stagnation to the vicissitudes of climate isn't a new pastime, of course. Nor indeed is the inclination to blame the climate for human warfare and for conflict. In the aftermath of the American Civil War, for example, a number of writers blamed the climate for the American Civil War. And briefly revisiting their accounts brings to the surface a critical issue with lingering resonance for our own time as we think about the discourses of climate and apocalypse. That is, the connections between climate, conflict, and culpability. The spirit of the Hippocratic tradition, mediated through Montesquieu, manifested itself in the writings of Ellen Churchill Semple in her account of the American Civil War. Semple was sure that climate not only modified human physiology, but also governed what she called the energy of different peoples, and thus their efficiency as, to use her words, their efficiency as political agents. But now, of course, that Hippocratic cosmos had been reworked into Darwinian categories. What she called the climatic control of early human settlement intensified the struggle for existence between human groups. And it delivered a kind of polarized world ruptured along a north-south divide, only too reminiscent of the Renaissance geohumoralists. The destiny of the old world's nations was written in the naturalized language of climate. This is what she had to say. Nature has fixed the mutual destiny of tropical and temperate zones. Now, it wasn't difficult to transfer that general principle that nature had determined mutual destinies of the tropical and temperate world. It wasn't difficult to transfer that across to the United States. She had this to say. The divergent development of northerners and southerners in America arose from contrasts in climate, soil and area. It was not only the enervating heat and moisture of the southern states, but also the large extent of their fertile area which necessitated slave labour, introduced the plantation system, and resulted in the whole aristocratic organisation of society in the south. Now, this isn't a million miles from what contemporary climate apocalypticists are actually saying, if you attend carefully to the language. Now, this climatic mindset had long been installed in Semple's outlook. It was a simple equation. Politics followed pedology. Slavery wasn't a matter of morality. It was merely a matter of sun and soil. Conflict boiled down to climate. As she put it in 1903, the question of slavery in the United States was primarily a question of climate and soil. The morale of the institution was long a mooted question until New England, having discovered the economic unfitness of the slave industry, took the lead in the crusade against it. The South, by the same token of geographical conditions, upheld the institution both on economic and on moral grounds. A few years later, in 1915, in the work Civilization and Climate, the well-known Yale environmental determinist Huntington, whom I mentioned earlier, still surfacing a lot in contemporary writings, insisted that in accounting for the contrasts between the northern and southern states, climatic effects, he said, were the most potent. This is what he had to say about slavery. Slavery, he judged, failed to flourish in the north not because of any moral objection to it, for the most godly Puritans held slaves, but because the climate made it unprofitable. 30 years later, in 1945, he was still pushing in 1945 economic climatology as the fundamental reason for the South's underdevelopment. And he went further by reducing ethical sentiments to the vagaries of the weather. The suppression of slavery in the North was not due chiefly to moral conviction, he pronounced. That arose long after experience had shown that slavery didn't pay in a cool climate. So what on the surface looked like a question of high moral principle was merely a case of low economic pragmatism. It was all a matter of meteorology, just like the prediction of the rise of latter-day millennial cults that we're seeing right now. But these accounts, of course, weren't the first to deliver a climatic reading of the Civil War. John William Draper's 3-volume History of the American Civil War, which appeared in 1867, had already done so. Now, Draper, of course, was president of New York University from 1850 to 1873, a professor of chemistry, and an architect, if not the chief architect, of the so-called conflict model of science and religion. In this account, he brought a scientist's eye to the writing of military history. Right up front, Draper proclaimed the great truth that societies advance in a preordained and inevitable course on account of what he described as uncontrollable causes. The chief one, of course, was climate. Like Montesquieu, Draper was convinced that climate exercised its global imperial power through human physiology, and that in turn conditioned different regions' character. It delivered a literal Weltanschauung, a literal worldview. For Draper, zonal climate, bodily organization, and mental character were tightly knitted together, and they therefore translated themselves into distinct economic regimes. The argument now flowed in entirely predictable channels, you'll know it well by now. Draper wanted his readers to see that the differentiation of the American nation into what he called the free and the slave powers had been achieved effectively through the agency of climate. That produced a geopolitical bipolarity ripe for internecine hostility. It's almost incredible to read. A self-conscious democracy was the climate issue in the North, and aristocracy, based upon human slavery, was the climate issue in the South. Climate is all-powerful. It was climate, and I quote him, that had separated the American nation into two sections. It was climate, and I quote, that made a North and a South. It was climate that had cultivated the distinctly marked political instincts of each culture. it could all be captured in a formula approaching a climatic syllogism. This is his general principle. Climate tendencies facilitate the abolition of slavery in a cold country, but oppose it in one that is warm. Now, it's not difficult to discern the appeal of Draper's climatic predestinarianism. What does it do? It delivers explanatory simplicity, political self-justification, and, of course, ethical absolution. For the sense of eschatological inevitability and humanity's following a script written by climate brought a great sense of moral relief. As Draper put it, now, when we appreciate how much the actions of men are determined by climate and other natural circumstances, our animosities lose much of their asperity, and the return of kind feelings is hastened. Climate's actions had the effect of freeing political history from the burdens of moral accountability. Naturalizing the causes of the Civil War was thus to him a key means of fostering good relations in the postbellum era, and the hope that what he called a more enlarged, a more enlightened, and in truth a more benevolent view of each other's proceedings may follow. By displaying to the world how climate had ghost-written different histories in the North and South, Draper, and I quote from his biographer, drew the sting from any moral recrimination. Indeed, one might suppose that the chief convenience and possibly the chief defect of the climatic view of history was to bypass ethical concerns altogether. The fusion of climate and conflict had the effect of squeezing culpability entirely out of the picture. Well, I'm beginning to approach the end of this talk. I want now just for a little while to say something about thinking about climate and conflagration and advertise some dissenting views. None of these, may I say, come from anyone who is a climate change denier or climate change skeptic of any kind. The fashion for reducing war to weather has resurfaced with renewed vigour in our own day, stimulated in part by the proclivities of funding agencies and the priorities of national governments. But this reductionist impulse has not met with universal approval. To dissenters, blaming climate for conflict anaesthetises moral accountability and sacrifices human agency to nature's presumed imperatives. A 2002 report for the German Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety, for instance, it stressed that climate change impacts will not be the single or main causes of future conflicts, and laid emphasis on the mitigating possibilities of cooperation and cooperative strategies. Climate change impacts do not pose a military threat, this report said, nor can they be solved with the traditional mindsets nor by the means of military services. The challenge of climate change might just as easily be the occasion for cooperation as for conflict, for global citizenship rather than the trumpeting of petty nationalisms, for social justice rather than the retention of economic power. Support for this kind of stance has been forthcoming from a number of researchers conducting empirical inquiries into the links in our own day between climate change and civil war. A team of ecologists based mostly at Colorado State University, for example, has disputed the claim that global warming has increased the risk of civil war in Africa. They argue that attributing such causal powers to climate oversimplifies systems affected actually by many geopolitical and many social factors. And they point out that unrelated geopolitical trends, most notably decolonization and the vicissitudes of the Cold War, which perturbed the political and social landscape of the African continent, tend to be ignored in climatic reductionist accounts. Halvard Bohag, a political scientist at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, has also serious reservations about what I'm calling climatic supremacism. Reworking a range of models used by advocates of climate's determining role in civil wars, he contends that, in fact, climate variability turns out to be a poor predictor of armed conflict, and that civil wars in Africa are far better explained by such conditions as prevalent ethno-political exclusion, poor national economy, and the collapse of the Cold War system. The prehistory of a particular violent episode is relevant too, for as he puts it, recent violence may affect the likelihood of a new conflict breaking out. Investigations of particular regions foster further skepticism about simply reducing conflict to climate. Take the case of Kenya. One recent study set out to test the neo-Malthusian thesis that resource scarcity stimulated by climate change explains the advent of civil war and the outbreak of intergroup violence. That thesis, it noted, defends a popular crisis narrative about sub-Saharan Africa that depicts the continent as miserably resourced and thus prone to violence provoked by periods of drought. Kenya provided a useful test case, since it has been the home, according to this study, to some of the bloodiest civil conflicts in the recent history of the entire continent. Focusing on the period from 1989 to 2004, and using geographically disaggregated data on armed conflicts, the study concluded with the arresting conclusion as follows. Climatic factors do influence the risk of conflicts and violent events, but the effect is opposite to what should be expected from much of the international relations literature. Drought, it turns out, was far from inciting violence, this report argued, arguably had a peaceful effect, a temporary cooling effect on tensions. What emerges as markedly more significant in fueling hostilities are ethnic antipathies, the recent advent of elections, the hope of political gain, not desperate scrambles for scarce land, pasture, and water resources. As the author put it elsewhere, in accounting for violent warfare, an exclusive emphasis on the role of resource scarcity tends to let governments off the hook. Empirical queries like these, which challenge the assumption that climate and climate change are the sole or even prime causes of violence, raise troubling concerns about the ease with which an ideology of climatic reductionism has infiltrated its way into national security consciousness. Critics of this determinist turn, and particularly of the Malthusian assumption that increased environmental scarcity and migration weaken states and cause conflict and violence, these critics express grave concerns about the lack of attention devoted to ascertaining the ways that environmental violence reflects or masks other forms of social struggle. For one thing, such scenarios take outbreaks of violence as merely the natural consequence of social evolutionary adaptation. Climate reductionism thus facilitates the sense that war can be, quotes, readily naturalized and depoliticized, with local culture and social relations always relegated to the sidelines. Now, I have no intention of further multiplying testimonials here. In conclusion, let me just refer to one other group of researchers already known for their work on how warmer than normal temperatures can increase the risk of violence in certain places, notably in East Africa. Acutely aware of the perils of a resurgent climatic fatalism, however, they have this to say. Some studies in environmental security are in danger of promulgating a modern form of environmental determinism by suggesting that climate conditions directly and dominantly influence the propensity for violence among individuals, communities, and states. When analysts, they say, neglect the complex political calculus of government and the remarkable ways in which human societies actually do cope with challenging environments, they reach conclusions that are little different from those ascribing poverty to latitudinal location or lessened individual productivity to hot climates, as was common in European and American scholarship about a century ago. And I've tried to demonstrate that with my examples this morning. Such proclivities, these authors believe, are most troubling when they surface among environmental security agencies, who presume that individuals and communities can't engage in positive coping behaviour to attenuate climate risks. Human society faces massive challenges in seeking ways to deal with global conflict and with climate change. But if these dissenters are to be believed, society would be better advised striving to weather the blame rather than spending a lot of time trying to blame the weather. Thank you.
Thank you, David. With time for questions, could I ask that if you have a question, put your hand up and I will come to you with the microphone, because we are being recorded, it's for that reason. Simon? Okay, thanks.
Rupert Reed, UEA. Thanks, David. Look, I agree with a lot of what you've said. I think there were a few kind of low blows along the way. I think it's unfair to punish Simon by guilt with association with people whose motives were completely different from his. But look, let's say you're basically right. The question is, what do we deduce from it? And I'm nervous about what you may want us to deduce from it, or what others may deduce from it, whether you want them to or not. So it seems to me that what's really useful about the kind of age of consequences stuff is simply that it gives the lie to climate denial. Yeah. And it makes absolutely clear the nonsensicality of the position of people like Trump. And we desperately need to face those consequences. The question is only, and I'm sure you'd agree with this, whether we do so humanely or not. Yeah. But it wouldn't be humane to say something like this, or to think something like this. Even when you are highly climate stressed, you can avoid conflict, and to deduce from that mitigation isn't actually that important compared to education, investment in conflict resolution, or what have you. Yeah. And it seems to me that there is a real danger of such a response, which might be called a humanist response, that would risk the hubristic assumption that we can cope with anything, that we're all powerful as long as we choose to be, as long as we cooperate, as long as we're at our best. It seems to me that such a humanist response would be actually profoundly arrogant. It would manifest exactly the kinds of habits of thought that have got us into this terrible trouble, and that it would actually, in the final analysis, be unhumane. So the question is, are you worried about that kind of possible response? How would you act against it? It seems to me it is entirely possible that is what will be deduced if arguments such as yours win the day. Sure.
Good. Well, thank you for the question. And of course, I agree most entirely with the sentiments that you're putting forward here. What might be deduced from it? I mean, but I think that you're right when you're talking about the age of consequences being a polemical document, and a document that is intended to as a polemic against those who are climate deniers and so on. And I think that there has to be such a polemic, but it has to be, I think, a fair polemic. I think it has to be one that is not overly dramatized, because if that's the case, then the resort to violence might actually be helped by a document of that sort, since it's predicting the inevitability of climate. That's going to the inevitability that climate will bring about violence of one sort and another. It's much more easy to justify it. So I would like to pose the question in a way: what would one deduce from the misuse of polemics, or the use of an overly polemic sort of stance on something? Now, you also say that mine could be in danger of being charged with a kind of humanist arrogance. And I think that's absolutely right. I mean, human agency is never entirely free or divorced from one's genetic makeup, environmental circumstances, political history, and the like. But my concern is the ease with which those are forgotten. I mean, it's just repeating what I've said in the paper. Can I say something about deducing from this more general consequences for academics? At least in the United Kingdom system now, we live in an age of the impact of scholarship. I mean, it's part of our research excellence framework assessment and so on. And I think that in that environment, quite often what happens is that scientists speaking overly dramatize for public consumption and in the public press what might be some of the implications of the research. And I'll give you one example of this. I thought about using this example this morning. Work that was done by paleoenvironmentalists on the environmental conditions during the time of the rise of Genghis Khan. this made sort of headline news across the internet with something like wet conditions was the greatest weapon in Genghis Khan's armory, explaining his entire kingdom. Can I just say in the 1930s and 40s it was dry conditions that were supposed to do that according to environmental determinants. Now it's wet ones. I went back and read the original article in the National Science Foundation and it was hedged about with some ifs and buts, consequences and so on. But when those same scientists were interviewed for the media and for the press, all the ifs and buts had disappeared. And it was a dramatic conclusion, overly dramatic, without the careful consequences, because I think they felt the need to be doing something that was seen to be relevant or impactful. And I'm not sure if in the long run that is in the best interest of science or indeed in the best interest of society. But I'm not using anything here to give succor to climate change deniers. I always get asked this question about climate change denying.
But the same exact risk is relevant to you, right? All your ifs and buts may also disappear, and people
Correct.
could quite easily say something like, right, so the message is, what really matters is we need to reduce ethnic rivalries, we need to have conflict resolution, etc. And that would be pretty cataclysmic.
Yeah, and I haven't said that.
No, but how are you going to guard against the ifs and buts being removed from yours?
Well, I'm not going to talk to a journalist and say it's all about agency.
Okay, good.
I'm not going to say it's all about ethnic, but I'm going to say it's about other things as well.
Sure, good.
But I think that often doesn't happen because you'll not get headlines for it. I think there's some filming going on here this morning. Maybe this is the first chance I've got to say my piece entirely uninterrupted.
Thank you. Any other question over here? I'll go back here and then straight to you, Mike.
Thank you very much, Dr. Livingstone. What a fabulous talk. I'm so pleased this is being recorded so that I can watch it again.
I don't want to see it again. And I don't want to see the action replay in slow motion.
Yes, that could be interesting. Yes. I'm Shailen Popp at University of Oxford, and I'm part of Department of Education there.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, with that lens, really, that how do we educate for this? Because it's so fascinating, but it's so specialist, isn't it? That one has to come to these types of events to really understand things on a deeper level. One has to take an interest. Our education system, in many ways, is so sophisticated that it doesn't prepare us for these types of realities. Several hundred years ago, we were probably much more able to be prepared to be less dependent on the modern conveniences and things. And I do wonder whether it's easier to avoid thinking about these aspects simply because we're afraid of our lack of preparedness as individuals and as a society. Is there a way in which we could actually have a sophisticated curriculum approach, a sophisticated assessment approach that could prepare individuals for dealing with possible changes that may occur within some decades to come? Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was quite a long question, but it wasn't long enough for me to think of an answer. So my final decision is, yeah, maybe. One would hope so. Just two things that, I think it's more a plea for having our curriculum modified in some ways. I'm not a specialist at all. I've gone into this as someone who works on the history of ideas, so I don't know really very much about the climate science dimension of it at all. And so I take on trust what the best climate scientists say. But I do think that it's one of the lamentable things, I think, in education is the lack of conversation between the humanities, the social sciences and the sciences. And I think that I would hope that this morning that at least one way or another, one can't think about climate issues without thinking both about the science and about the ethics that are involved and about human behavior and so on. I would like to see more courses that integrate materials of this sort. I happen to work in a school where there are climate scientists and physical scientists as well as people studying aspects of the humanities and social sciences, and we don't always get along all that well. We're suspicious of each other and so on. But when I do have a climate change question, I have someone I can go and ask about it. So I just think if there were more opportunities to think about these problems in holistic ways rather than increasingly specialist ones, that would be good. And this is why I think a meeting like this, which combines academics and others who are not academics, is a very useful thing to have. But I have no secret elixir as to how to transform the curriculum to be able to do this. I would just hope people would do so. Michael had a question here, I think.
David, I'm fascinated by the resonance with the evolutionary story.
Yes.
With all of these evolutionists of the 19th century explaining the fact that the reason why we white people have got bigger brains than black people is precisely because the struggle was much tougher in, in Bedford than it was in
Belfast.
Yes, right. Than in the Congo. And I'm wondering to what extent you actually see the same people writing on these, people appealing, cross-appealing in this, what should we say, from evolution to, what should we call this, ecology, something like that, and back and forth. I mean, that's a question, not a, this is not a criticism, just a question.
Yeah. I think there's a huge amount, and if I've got your question right, there are two dimensions to it. I mean, I think there's a huge amount of Darwinian vocabulary that's in this entire debate, mostly Malthusian, translated in through sort of natural selection and adaptationism and so on. There's a fair amount of popular Lamarckism in here too, as you will probably know better than I. But there's also an interesting crossover between the 19th century writers and 21st century writers. In the mid-20th century, 1940, 50, 60, and so on, Ellsworth Huntington's writings, that's the crude environmental determinist, were not only criticized but lampooned in the academy. They were thought to totally downplay human agency. They were also thought to be racially troublesome. They were bound up, this story about climate was bound up with the eugenics movement and so on. And yet I've been amazed in the 2010, 15 and so on, there's still a continuing resort to Huntington's writings with the claim, of course, that they're not importing the racial material, but nonetheless, his basic science is still coming through in modern writings. And you mentioned about brains. I thought you were going to compare not Belfast and not Bedford and Beirut, but Bedford and Belfast. You know, we're a lot wetter. Someone said our temperament is the result of bad weather and a diet of potatoes in Ireland. But,
it's just too warm.
But what I've discovered is the business about brains. There are a number of climate scientists, amazingly, saying things like, if global climate increases by 1 degree, it will cook our brains. And then I think there are some places in the world where it's already a degree higher than we are here. So, I mean, it's that kind of sloppy language that I think this is an appeal to be more careful, is what I'm really trying to say. So I think there are a lot of resonances, Michael, and actually I suspect you know about them more than I do.
Can I just make one follow-up comment?
Yeah, sure.
And I think this is pertinent to where we are here, is, as you know, one of the things I'm very interested in as a you is the extent to which one moves from, let's say, straight professional science to this kind of stuff, to Gaia, to, as you know, to talking about war.
Indeed.
And I'm absolutely fascinated to see how there is, there really are some good scientists working on climate, and they know things which are true.
Absolutely.
And yet, then you move up here, and it's so interesting to me the extent to which the tropes and metaphors of religion, and not necessarily the Anglican, although it can be, as in Darwin's case, but it's fascinating to me to see how quickly one moves from the basic professional science to, well, as I say, science as religion, with secular religion. And I'm fascinated to see this as a perfect case study.
Well, I think also there are forces that are, as I was trying to say earlier, pushing scientists in that direction. And one of these is to do with what impact is government investment in science having back on the society. And that forces scientists again and again to find an application, so that when you're now applying to many of the research funding agencies, unless you have a practical outcome, unless you have, you know, and people are running out an exhibition at a museum or claiming this, that, and the other, they will not get funded. The other thing that's interesting about that, I should just say in passing, is that paleo-environmentalists seemed to discover that ancient climate change had produced the human brain, that's a quote, exactly at the time when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change were bringing out its results. So you wonder what was driving the science funding agenda, reflecting what's going on right now. And then an area that had never thought about this before, suddenly, if it wants to get a grant, has to have climate change built into it. And for a while, the National Science Foundation was operating that way. There's a social history of science which you and I know about.
Another question back here.
Yeah.
Hi, Sally Annett. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
I was struck by the very interesting narrative that you had created, and would be interested to know who are the IR links that are making, you know, there were a few. When you're talking about constructive narratives, I felt that yours was a highly constructive narrative, and was wondering what it was meant to elicit in me as a listener. Because clearly there's a huge interconnected network of causes. You could take Apoduri's 5 landscapes and add in medicalisation as a 6th aspect, all of those kind of things. But it seems to be a battle about resources, and climate is hugely impactful on resources. We are, you know, connected to the environment. So somewhere in that was lost for me. That and perhaps oversimplified, and perhaps potentially insulting to certain people who would not wish to be portrayed as upholding sort of eugenics beliefs from the 18th century.
Well, I think there's 3 things I would say about this. First of all, what response am I trying to elicit from you? I mean, I'm just trying to elicit care. That's all. I'm not pushing a particular line on this. I'm saying that there have been overstatements, and I wonder if those overstatements have done as much damage as anything else. Of course, I'm not accusing all international relations people as adopting eugenics, but I'm pointing out that there is a history here, and that being aware of this history is not unimportant in how we're conducting affairs right now, especially if you're going back to writers who were so directly connected with the eugenics movement, as in this case, he was the president of the American Eugenics Society. I think that's not unimportant to know in the present generation. But my constructed narrative, of course, is a constructed narrative, and it's a narrative that comes from a much wider project that I'm working on. And because you've asked, this is not intended to be insulting to anybody at all. My narrative revolves around a history that I want to write of the idea that climate is the main determinant of human culture. This story today is about apocalypse and war. I have a comparable story about human wealth. I have a comparable story about health. I have another story I want to write about mental health. I have a story I want to write about climate change and evolution. I'm really interested in what I'm calling climate reductionism. It's a history of the inclination to reduce human life to nothing but climate. Other people think we're reduced to nothing but genes. Other people think we're reduced to nothing but synaptic firing in the brain. There are a whole species of these, and I'd love to write them, but you know, I'm about to retire and I'm never going to get them done. So this is just one chapter or one section out of a series of 7 or 8 reductionisms that I'm trying to write, and I maybe should have said that at the beginning, because that has sort of can I say, constructed or at least steered the narrative in the direction that I've been putting it.
Thank you. That makes much more sense then.
Good. I'm glad.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Time for one more, I think. Anybody? Okay. Last question.
Thought you were going to give me a break.
My name's Steve Dolan. I just happen to be a local. But
Steve,
I'm not from the humanities side way back when. Academically, I'm from the science side of nuclear physics. But what strikes me, a lot that's been said around scientists being indiscreet as they speak to the media.
Yeah.
I recognise that, but I also struggle a bit with the use of the word scientist in that context.
Oh, yeah.
Science studies stuff and seeks to do so by, should we say, rational means. You can shoot me down, but that's an overgeneralisation, I know. people are engaged in that activity. Yeah. Once they are no longer engaging in that activity, is it useful to call them scientists? There are part of the general population who happen to have a particular background. And it's something I find very difficult, not today, but listening to the press, listening to the radio, the press. Scientists say this, that, and t'other. Yeah. And it's always not actually what they said. Yeah. It's usually a summary of what they perhaps injudiciously said, moving from their scientific professionalism into trying to communicate with the wider world. And I think that's, speaking on the part of, as an ex-scientist, you know, I do find that a bit wearying at times. Yeah. But more generally, could I say that, yes, that's very telling how you've presented all of this. But to my eye, what it's saying is that positive historicism and all that, black and white solutions are what it's all about. These analyses can only be partial. They have to recognise, perhaps they don't, but I'm sure that it is recognised there are other factors as well. Yeah. It's highlighting a possible influence of one. Yeah. And around today's discussion, climate is a very dodgy word, because I would say climate has driven bits of civilization in a way you haven't touched on at all. Sure. And that's that massive, great climatic gift to Saudi Arabia that sits under the Arabian Peninsula. Good.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Just a couple of things by way of response. You describe yourself as an ex-scientist. Human beings could describe themselves as ex-apes. Actually, not a bad way to put it. Can I just say two things? You know, I think I'm being interpreted here as gunning for the scientists. And, well, I am. But I also have a feeling that scientists in their institutions are expected to court the media now. They are sort of expected, and you know, I think it's really important that we should communicate. Scientists should communicate with the public. I think the public pays their salary and so on. But my concern is when they feel they have to over-dramatize what they've found. I mean, on the website of my university, you'd think that every day we were finding a new cure for cancer. You know, dramatic new event, you know, and I mean, the cancer survival rates aren't great in Northern Ireland, really. So, I don't know where the claims are coming from. But so I think that there's something in how government and research funding agencies and so on expect certain things from scientists, and part of that is a fear now about what you might call useless science. A wonderful book came out a few years ago called "The Usefulness of Useless Knowledge." You never know the value of the knowledge, maybe until 20, 30 years or whatever. And pushing people into saying this is what it is now, I just think, personally, I think that is a mistake. But I'm hesitant, I have to say, about definitions. You say that when a scientist is doing that, they're not being a scientist anymore. And it could take the rest of this conference to come up with an agreed upon definition of science. We've one person in the room who tried to get a definition of this in an American court of law, and he and I have disagreed, right, Michael, on what your definition of science to that court really was. I wouldn't also like it to be thought that science is ever purely and irreducibly a cognitive activity. Scientists, practicing science, are human beings. Aspects of their humanity, their gender, their background, enter into the laboratory. And I think that we should just always be aware that there can be a spillover from those social dimensions into the scientific work. On the other hand, I'm far from reducing science to merely being social relations or anything of that sort. But thank you for your observations. I think they're really important observations, that especially in an era when climate science or various other sciences are in the public eye, we really need to exercise a lot of care.
Thank you, David.
Okay, Simon.